Hello, guys. Uh, Welcome all of you for the day two session. So, today being the day two, we are going to talk about mostly related with the implementing of Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure itself. So, in that context, what is more important for us is to understand the key elements in terms of services which are hosted on Azure. So, everything would be associated and interrelated with Azure Virtual Desktop only, whether it is related to the network, whether it is related to the storage, everything. All right. So it's not about implementation itself. It's basically all about the security as well. All right. So that is more important for us to understand that what are the options, choices for the storage, whether I'm going to go with the managed or unmanaged either. So we had fairly discussed about these ones yesterday, but today itself we are going to talk about more in detail. So the plan would be, first of all, we are going to start with a small recap for the yesterday session. And that is after that one immediately, we will moving down to the contents which we have planned for today. And then after, towards the end of the session, there would be a small demo as well also. So be there with us, and it's really appreciated for each one of you. You have especially taken out some time from your busy schedule and being a part of this session. Thank you so much for being there itself. So let's start right now. So as you can see, the topic, what the plan is basically for today, it's all about implementing an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure itself. So let me just give you a quick insight about this module. All right. As we know that the services are all hosted on Azure, that means that each and every service, it does requires a bit of, not a bit, rather I would say a good amount of planning and designing. So it becomes the responsibility for the relevant team, the one which takes care of this area. The purpose is not to simply go and deploy the service. That is not what I'm looking for. What we are looking for is from the best practices and also from the recommendations, from the structures, and keeping in mind about the key requirement. Now, when we are talking about Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure itself, we do understand that there are so many different elements which are associated, whether you talk about firewall, whether you talk about services, whether you talk about storage, whether you talk about directory service, whether you talk about network, whether you talk about database, whether you talk about infrastructure availability, everything. So overall, the point is to understand is that it's not just a part of the implementation and deploying and creating up a host pool, setting up the session host server, setting up the user profiles. That is not the goal. Although that is key requirement, we do understand, but keeping in mind the other areas which are also the key factors. So in this particular module, at least we are going to see some of those elements, the networking components, connectivity methods, again, the best practices, approaches from the security aspect, from the governance aspect, from the connectivity aspect, everything. And as the information is going to be stored onto the cloud, so definitely at that particular point of time, the storage also comes up in between. So it again depends whether we are approaching for the managed or unmanaged. If you remember yesterday, I had given you some slight information about the managed and unmanaged. Managed in the sense that is all being taken care of by Azure. So you can utilize the disks, you can utilize the storage, but when it comes down to the security, when it comes down to the replication, when it comes down to the availability, is all being taken care of by Azure. But if in case, if we are looking up from the unmanaged, that means the customer is going to be responsible for that. That means the storage plays a very key role. How? When you build up any kind of a compute, when you build up any kind of a service, most of the services, they do require storage at the back end. So storage itself has different types, different types of contents. Likewise, for example, blob, the page blob, the block blob, you've got queues, you've got tables, you have file shares. So this storage plays a very key role. When it is, or when we are talking about performance, there are different types of disks, HDD, ultra disks, premium disks. So keeping in mind in terms of latency, keeping in mind in terms of the throughput, keeping in mind in terms of sizing. So we have to consider each and every factor. Creating the storage is not the goal. The purpose is basically to understand each and every element of those storage areas. So tomorrow, if in case if I create up a storage, so in that case, there are many such default settings. So do I need to consider and take it as it is, the default settings? The answer is no. Why? Why? Because due to some default settings, it might be a possibility that, say, for example, if I talk about the network security, maybe the ports are all open. So what do I need? In that case, I need to think about that which kind of a traffic is going to be allowed, which kind of services are allowed, how I'm going to structure my network. And if you remember yesterday, when we had discussed about some networking components and the architecture of Azure Virtual Desktop, we had seen that a network being splitted into different subnets. And each of these workloads were being placed in different subnets. Why it was being done, why that approach was taken. The major reason was isolation. The major reason was privacy, policies, filtering, network routing, firewall. So if in case, if these are the key requirements, then it becomes key factor. So overall, see these things, these are the areas what we are going to talk about in this module. So let's crack on and move down to the next part. So once again, I would like to welcome each one of you on the day 2 session and welcome back. So before we moved on, let's have a quick look to the what is going to be the plan, what is going to be the schedule, and what are the lessons we are going to discuss in this session. So the overall module, what we are going to talk about is all related with the implement and Azure virtual desktop infrastructure. So the lessons, what we are going to talk about would be related to the networking and storage. So already gave you some insight about the topics, but we are going to talk about more in detail about each of these ones. Along with that one, towards the end of the session itself, we will be having a small demo. Into the demo itself, at least you will be able to understand how the services are looked up, where the services are located, and if the services are there, what are the areas we have to look into. So whether it is related to the network, whether it is related to the storage. And obviously, after the end of the session itself, there will be a small homework lab for you. So into that particular lab itself, you are going to set up the host pools, session host servers, configuring the host pools, deploying them, setting up the host. So the approach can be graphical, approach can be PowerShell. And one more thing which you can see over the screen that I have used a term ADDS and Azure ADDS. So what is ADDS? ADDS is nothing but Active Directory domain services. The traditional Active Directory domain controller, what we have been using on-prem, the full-fledged domain controller, where itself the identities, the users, the groups, the OUs, the policies, the sites, domains, using Kerberos, using LDAP is being used. And if I'm talking about Azure Active Directory domain service, so this is one of the managed services from Azure in which if you deploy, Microsoft is going to provide, Azure is going to deploy two servers for you. So in that case, it is not going to be an infrastructure as a service. That means you can't take the remote access to those servers, but they're providing you the full-fledged ready to use domain controllers. The domain name you can pick up, and you can also join the machines, the client machines to that domain. So if that is possible, then if I see that, okay, you can't take up a remote desktop, you can't remotely connect to those servers. No, you can't. But yes, it is possible that you can join the client machine, and from the client machine itself, you can install the administrative tools, LDS tools, with the help of which you can remotely manage those individual services like DNS, Active Directory users and computers, Active Directory sites and services. So this Azure Active Directory domain service provides you almost every functionality what the traditional Active Directory provides us. Yes, there are some architecture limits. First of all, it's a managed service, right? And the good thing is that for the customer, they don't need to maintain and manage the infrastructure for that. For us, we can utilize that service. So there are so many different types of workloads. The one which needs the integration for the Kerberos, LDAP, GPUs, OUs. So you can leverage that particular product. But on the other side, if we are looking for the full-fledged infrastructure as a service domain controllers, so nothing is better than the regular standard Active Directory. So comparatively, both of them, they're quite equivalent to each other. But yes, keeping in mind the service limits, the architecture limits as well. So that is going to be the schedule for today itself. All right, guys. And before we kick on with the technical contents for today itself, let me quickly give you a recap for the day one session. See, yesterday itself, what exactly did we did? Yesterday, we started the day with a small, quick introduction, and then we started with a plan for the day in which we had discussed about the Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture, designing virtual desktop architecture, designing for user identities and profiles. When we had started with the discussion about Azure Virtual Desktop Architecture itself, we understood about each and every component. Now, into that architecture itself, we had discussed about that which services are being managed by Microsoft and which services are being managed by the customer. So setting up the host pool, setting up the session host, setting up the application groups, setting up the security, setting up the connectivity, defining up the compute size, everything has to be taken care of by the customer. So what is being taken care of by the Azure or Microsoft? In that case, they are taking care of the Azure Virtual Desktop Services, which has its own remote desktop services, license service, gateways, web services, everything. So that is something really good. And for the customer, it becomes the critical decision. Why? Well, because everything goes in terms of infrastructure as a service. You're deploying your virtual machines, you're setting up the sizes, you're defining up the scaling, availability. So the point was not to set up the simple VM. No, not at all. The point was to understand that what are the other areas we have to look into. If you remember, we had also discussed about high availability, in which we talked about infrastructure availability, we talked about application availability. Both of them are equally important. How? The infrastructure, the one on which the compute is residing, the compute is being deployed, that infrastructure itself has to be redundant. That means it is possible that we can have multiple servers on different racks, on different blade servers, in different data centers. What are we going to achieve with that? Simple. In that case, we are setting up the infrastructure redundancy. So tomorrow, if in case, even if one of the data center goes down, the one of the rack goes down, in that case, at least we have got another server identical running up on the different host. So this eliminates in terms of no single point of failure. On the other side, the availability of the application is also important. Why? Why? Because the availability of the application is also very, very critical. And that can be achieved in different ways depending on the type of the workload you have deployed. So into that discussion itself, we took an example of Active Directory servers. How would you ensure the domain controllers are highly available? What do? You simply configure multiple domain controllers, read-write domain controllers, read-only domain controllers. So why? What are you achieving with that? At least if one of the domain controller goes down, the other domain controller itself is in place, which again eliminates the no single point of failure. On the other side, if I take an example of another workload, let's say web server, the one on which the web services, the websites are running, how would you ensure that? So what are you having? You're having multiple web servers. and that too identical setup in terms of compute, in terms of application, in terms of website, in terms of content, everything. And even though you have configured everything identical, how are you going to load balance it? In that case, simple. We are going to use some sort of a load balancer, the one which can load balance the web services. So on one side, you are setting up the infrastructure availability, and on the other side, you are also setting up the application availability. So Azure Virtual Desktop is also one of the service which is going to be configured session host. So in that context, we had discussed about the load balancing methods, the breadth first, depth first. In those cases, that also helps us in terms of how much amount of compute is going to be utilized. Are we going to have a number of servers being up and running and incurred a good amount of cost, which might not be justified always in terms of business, right? So that section was being discussed. When it came down to the discussion of design Azure Virtual Desktop architecture itself, we talked about the load balancing methods as well. We said talked about the different pools, whether you want to go with the persistent, non-persistent setups, what is exactly a profile is. Although we didn't went much in detail about the profile, but yes, slightly we had talked about that area itself. So other than that itself, we also talked about the dependent components. And as we are hosting the service onto the cloud, into that context, one more element comes up, which is none other than your directory service. And that is nothing but my Azure Active Directory, which is now being referred as Microsoft Intro ID. So sometime back itself, this architecture change happened, terminology change updated up. So many people, they know that service by the name of Azure Active Directory. So it's good that we should adapt the new terms, products. So when we're talking about Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Intro ID itself, it's as good as a pass. And that directory service provides us the different types of identities. Now, which different types of identities? Like say, for example, you've got a user, a cloud user, a guest user, or hybrid user. So Azure Active Directory is a bit different from the on-prem Active Directory. Question comes up, how? So the answer to that one is basically Azure Active Directory is something which falls under the pass, first of all. In terms of authentication, we are using web services, HTTPS, SAML, Federation Service, Single Sign-On, OpenID Connect. And when it comes down to the authorization, we are using OAuth. OAuth stands for Open Authorization. So there are different protocols which are being used, single sign-on mechanism. And in case if we talk about does the Azure Active Directory gives the support for LDAP, GPO, OUs? No. Azure Active Directory is completely a flat structure. So that means there is no hierarchical management of the objects. Likewise, on your on-prem AD, you have OUs, you have got different domains. So in that context, it becomes easy and convenient. But yes, Azure Active Directory gives you the support of policies, which is being referred as conditional access policy, CAP. I repeat it again. It's called CAP, conditional access policy, which also helps us to contribute towards the zero trust principle, in which simply we don't trust, we just verify everything. And conditional access policy helps us to achieve that. And that is again a part of the Azure Active Directory premium editions. In that case, when we talk about editions, Azure AD itself has different editions. The one which comes up by default, free edition, the one which comes with a Microsoft 365 subscriptions, even that is also free. So you got Premium 1, Premium 2. So 4 editions in total. The Premium 1 and Premium 2, these are all license based. But yes, Premium 2 being one of the highest ones. Highest in terms of what? In terms of features, functionalities. So everything which is related to the identity governance, identity security, identity compliance, most of those features are supported in your Premium 2. So these editions, so different types of users. When you go and set up hybrid in the sense identity hybrid, connection with the on-prem Active Directory, and in between the connector which comes up. And that connector is nothing but my Azure Active Directory Connect, AAD Connect. So Azure AD Connect is the one which helps you to connect your Microsoft Active Directory on the on-prem, and it also connect to the Azure Active Directory onto the cloud, with the help of which you create multiple connectors, and those connectors are helping you out with the import and export mechanism of the identities, creating up the channels, authentication. Although the customer has got the flexibility to pick and choose which identities, there are so many different filters which are basically based on domains, OUs, attributes. Along with that one, when you're setting up the identity hybrid authentication methods, there are different authentication methods like PHS. So just to remind you, we're still onto the recap of day one session. So one more the authentication method was PHS, password hash authenticate, password hash synchronization, pass-through authentication, federation service. Although the customer has got a flexibility to pick and choose and use a combination of these ones as well, if they wish. Maybe I can use federation service as a primary, and I can use as a failover as a password hash, PHS. So each and every authentication method has its own different use case, and the amount of administrative overhead which is required to set them up, it depends. So among the three, PHS is one of the simplest and the easiest method. And the other side, if I talk about the federation service, yes, too many steps. But yes, as per the best practices, it has to be set it up. So the FS, the federation service authentication is the one on which in which the user experiences the redirection towards the on-prem, get the authentication, come back, validation, and again he's being redirected back to the cloud. And the second method was pass-through authentication, which also gives you a single sign-on, in which the users are not redirected. Rather, they just provide the username and a password to the Azure AD, and the Azure Active Directory stores them into a queue. And on the on-prem, you have got an agent. That agent is called pass-through authentication agent, and that is running on a server, physical or virtual. So that agent retrieves the credentials from that queue, which is onto the Azure AD, fetches the credential, takes it to the on-prem AD, validates, and then generates up a token and gives it back to the Azure AD. Upon the successful validation, it again generates up a token, and based onto that, the user gets authenticated. So for the users, it is completely seamless. They would never come to know that the authentication is happening from the on-prem, and the process is very much fast. So when it comes down to the user identities and profiles, these things are really important for us to understand. So see, guys, this was or these were the areas what we had discussed yesterday. So at least now you've got a good understanding, and that is where exactly we are going to continue from. So the schedule for today itself, as discussed earlier, we are going to talk about each and every element which helps us in terms of planning, and in terms of implementing the Azure virtual desktop infrastructure itself. So here it comes. So when we are talking about implement an Azure virtual desktop infrastructure itself, one of the areas which is being taken care of is network. Now, when we talk about networking, you know that the networking is very important. Why? Why? Because that helps us to set up a landing environment or any kind of a workload which you're going to plan, which you're going to deploy. Even though if you have been working in an on-prem, the same concept applies. Why? Why? Because when you, it is not the reason that, okay, we have to just simply go and create a standard network and my job is done. No, it's basically to set up the network, set up the subnets. These are called tiers. And these tiers are being also being referred as subnets. So why tiers? Why? Because from the security point of view, from the isolation point of view, from the privacy point of view, these subnets, these tiers have to be segregated. Otherwise, in that case, the challenges would be there. Technically, it is possible that you can keep all your workloads in one subnet. No doubt, exceptions are there. Now, which exceptions? Exceptions like there are certain services in Azure which do require their own dedicated specific subnet with their own specific subnet range, with their own specific subnet name as well. So it's not all about services. So that means depending on the type of the workload, maybe if I take an example, say for instance, if I have domain controllers, if I have database servers, if I've got web servers, virtual desktop servers, technically you can keep them all into the one subnet. It works, but does it falls under the best practices? Answer is no, not at all. Why? Why? Because for an IT administrator, for the network administrator, it becomes a challenge in terms of what? In terms of delegation, in terms of compliance, in terms of privacy, in terms of segregation, in terms of isolation. Maybe the challenge, let's say, for example, if I keep them into one subnet and you allow an access, again, a security compromise comes into the picture. You never know. Yes, but if in case if you've got all the features in place, definitely yes, we can protect. In this case, if you simply take that, okay, we all are living in a house. The house itself has got a boundary. The boundary is being protected with the security walls. Your house is being protected with the doors. Doors are being protected with the security locks, fingerprint locks, isn't it? Why do you do that? And in the house itself, you've got different rooms. Living room is there. Your balconies are there. Similarly, there are different rooms. Why? Why? Because the guest rooms are there. This is a simple ideology itself, which we map it up. But yes, in that context, the point which has to be understood is that we need privacy for each and every workload, isn't it? I hope you guys agree with that. So in that situation, I'm not going to make everyone reside in one room, how can you achieve the privacy? And this privacy can only be achieved if you've got different subnets for different workloads. A subnet for the database server, a subnet for the application server, a subnet for the web application services, a subnet for the application gateway, a subnet for the Active Directory, subnet for the gateway. So in that situation, a subnet for the management subnet, at least if in case if we have those subnets in place, it becomes much convenient for the network guys, for the network team to handle it, to manage it. So even if in case if you're planning to go and deploy your Azure virtual desktop infrastructure itself, which involves in setting up the host pools, setting up the session host servers, which itself is a VM. Uh, when we're talking about the VM, that reminds that yesterday we had also talked about the sizing and pricing as well. Let's not forget that. And most importantly, the region in which these resources are being deployed. And most importantly, how you can organize them logically. Even this was a part of the discussion yesterday, in which we talked about management groups, we talked about the subscription, we talked about the resource group hierarchy. So logical organizing the resources is also one of the key factors in which you can achieve a best practice. That way, for the IT admin guys, for the network team, for the operations team, for the infrastructure team, it becomes easy in terms of delegation. Who is responsible for what? Accountability, policies, compliance, governance. So in that context, this service, the component has to be taken care of. So in this section itself, we are going to talk about the network connectivities. We are going to talk about the connectivities to the internet on-prem and understanding the Azure virtual desktop network connectivity. And by the way, the topics what we are talking about, the discussion which we are making up, all these concepts are directly related to your exam contents as well. That means from the preparation point of view, from the planning point of view, all these discussions are going to help you to help prepare for the exam. Although we have one session towards the end, day 5, which has been especially being kept for the exam prep session, in which you are going to understand and recap each and every important element from the exam perspective. So continuing with this one, we talk about Azure Virtual Desktop Network Connectivity. We talk about network security. What exactly in network security? Maybe the firewall, maybe the gateway, maybe the Azure firewall. So along with that one, if we are hosting any kind of a workloads onto the cloud, the connectivity which comes up, let's say you deploy a database server, you deploy a domain controller. By any chance, if in case if I need to have a remote management, remote connectivity, how will that be possible? Maybe if you're having some Linux machines, SSH. If you're having Windows machine, you prefer to go with the RDP. So if I go with the RDP or SSH, what are you doing? You're going with the ports 3389, SSH ports are there. So rather than opening those ports, you can also go with the approach of by using something which is called Azure Bastion. Bastion is also one of the very relevant service which helps you to connect, remotely connect those servers, whether Windows, whether Linux. It all helps you to go and connect with the TLS, HTTPS, port 443. So at least publicly, you don't need to open the RTP and the SSH ports. So this again leverages, basically you can go and connect over the browser. You don't need any specific client to be installed. So Azure Bastion, which also requires a separate dedicated subnet within that VNet. So when we're talking about the VNet, it is also possible that there can be multiple different VNets as well. Maybe in one VNet for one branch location, another VNet for another branch location for different workloads. So the question here comes up that will it be possible for us to connect each and every network? Answer is yes. How? That means you're creating and designing a topology, the network topology. And one of the most common topology which has been seen, which has been adopted, is being referred as hub and spoke topology. This hub and spoke topology is the one with the help of which you can have a granular control on what? The granular control in terms of routing, in terms of firewall, in terms of filtering, in every aspect. So in that case, at least you have got a control that which VNets can communicate through which VNet. So hub and spoke. So that also gives us the visibility. That also gives us the monitoring capability. So at everything becomes centralized. If the communication is happening all through the centralized, you can understand that there would be a less administrative overhead to configure them and to set them up. Although you can go with a full mesh topology, which increases a good amount of administrative overhead. But if I see from the beneficial point of view, then yes, each and every VNet being connected to each and every VNet connected to every VNet. So full mesh topology. But practically, it increases bit of overhead. But at least you don't have some sort of a unreliability or no single point of failure between the networks. But yes, but from the cost effective, from the best practices, hub and spoke comes up. So these all services are being preferable. And as you're talking about the hub and spoke, that also helps you to get connected in a hybrid with on-prem. And with that structure in place, you can still implement the security features as well. So moving ahead with the Bastion, you have some network topologies to troubleshoot your connectivities, connection flows, and that is where the network watcher comes up. And towards the end of this module itself, we will be having a small demo after both the lessons are being considered and covered itself. So let's go on and crack on. So when we talk about the network connectivity, now which connectivity we are talking about? As you can see on a screen, you've got a Azure uh, virtual desktop services, which includes the gateway, the web access, which includes your broker service, web services, diagnostic service. So that all falls under the Azure PaaS. And that piece of section is being taken care of by the vendor. So who is the vendor? Azure, Microsoft. All right. And what is being taken care of by the customer? The host, the session host, the pool, the desktop host, application and the desktop host. if you say that. And with that itself, it is possible that you can have a network connectivity, communication, which can be done. For the time being, let's keep the Azure Virtual Desktop aside. What are the different network connectivity methods? We have point to site. Imagine a situation that the people who are working remotely, traveling, or working from remote locations, working from home, we have the concept of connecting over the VPN, the client VPN, I mean to say. So, in that context, the point to site comes into the picture. And on the other side, we have a dedicated site to site connectivity. So, if I talk about the point to site, that itself is a VPN over the internet. Similarly, if we have got site to site VPN, even that also goes over the internet. But yes, the good thing is that it is site to site, end to end. Yeah, the only challenge would be the network bandwidth, latency, availability, performance. But if I see the benefit side, it is quite cost effective and easy to set up. But keeping in mind the business criticality, application criticality, services criticality, availability of the networks, availability of the communication, in that case, you go with the approach of express route. Express route, which is on the other side, which helps us to achieve a private, dedicated connectivity, with the help of which you can establish the connection. So express route is something which is again a bit of costly solution, no doubt, more administrative overhead. And from the setup point of view, yes, in which there are the providers, likewise Microsoft itself is a provider in between, with the help of which you can go and set up express route to the data centers, the environment where exactly your services are hosted, isn't it? So in that case, yes, express route is more preferable in in compared with site to site. Yes, keep the point to site aside. Why? Because point to site itself has a different business use case. All right, that is how it goes. So from the connectivities, yes, the communication and the approach. So the on-premises has got a flexibility to establish such connections. And depending on the use cases, you can have a combination of these ones as well. Mainly, if I talk about from the availability perspective, primarily you can use express route, and for the failover, for the backup, you can use site to site. That also comes under the best practices as well. And this reminds that there is one of the product service which helps you in terms of planning, adopting the best practices, designing. There is nothing but the Azure CAP structure, the one which gives you the adoption framework in which you can understand some best practices. So moving ahead, when it comes down to the managed connectivity itself, I gave you the example of point site to site, express route. So each one of these ones are having their own business use case. Say for instance, if I've got a network on on-prem and I've got a network onto the cloud. So these, what is the key benefit of using these connectivity methods? These connectivity methods, they help you to achieve what? With the help of this one, you can go with a workload distribution mechanism. That means you can distribute your workloads between on-prem and on cloud. So tomorrow, if in case if you say that, okay, hey, I want to keep some of the domain controllers on the on-prem and I want to keep some of the domain controllers onto the cloud and keeping the connectivity between them. How is that possible? That is only possible if in case if you have got the connectivity method in between. It's not a point of the domain controller. It can be any kind of a workload. Tomorrow, let's say, for example, if I set up a workload onto cloud and I've got some workload on the on-prem, say, for instance, the backup or monitoring tool, you've got a SCOM, System Center Operations Manager. And if you, by any chance, if there is a business need to monitor those workloads which are residing onto the cloud, how will that be possible? So in between, again, what comes in? The connectivity. So the connectivity itself, it becomes a base and that helps you to achieve this sort of scenarios. So technically speaking up, it is nothing but the workload distribution. Any sort of a workload distribution. And that workload distribution also requires the structure to be created up in which you can go ahead and maintain and manage the security as well also. So from the connectivity aspect, if you see, yeah, what I just talked about, the point to site to site, express route. So express route is all, this connection is purely private and the traffic does not go over the internet. So depending on to the business use case. So the site to site VPN has its own gateway, which is called the Azure VPN gateway. And on the other side, the Azure Express route also has its own gateway, Azure Express route gateway. You can't use the same gateway for the site to site and express route. No. But yes, the same gateway can be used for the point to site and for the site to site as well. That way you can save some sort of a cost. But as far as the express route is being considered, it requires its own dedicated gateway. And by the way, in between, the partner comes up. There are many such partners which have been validated and verified and being recommended. And Microsoft itself is also one of the partners to provide such services too. So what is the purpose of using them? As I mentioned earlier, the hybrid connectivity, the private connectivity. So tomorrow, if in case if I want to reach out to the resources which are there onto the cloud with a private connectivity, these ones are going to help you out. So there might be a situation. There might be a situation that, okay, there is a security team. They just want to connect a specific set of a workload from their network. So point to site might be a choice for them. But if in case if I need to have a site to site end to end connectivity, that is where the site to site VPN comes up. And on top of it, you have your express route, which is dedicated. So if you talk about the preference might be express route, but I have to consider other factors as well. The cost being one of the biggest factors as well. If the business need is there, then it has to be there. Simple like that, isn't it? So point to site to site, express route, and all the components. When we're talking about these network connectivity methods, the service for which we are here is none other than your Azure Virtual Desktop. Even Azure Virtual Desktop is completely based. That is also one of the kind of workloads. So is there a need that we can filter the traffic, connectivities, firewalls? Can we do that? Yes, you can. So having the hub and spoke topology, which gives you all those flexibilities. So when it comes down to the Azure Virtual Desktop network connectivity, this is also, as I mentioned, that it's also one of the key workloads, and it does needs a connectivity. There is a dependency. Why? Why? Because you might be using Active Directory on the on-prem for the authentication, joining the machines to the domain. So don't you require any kind of a connectivity? Yes, you do require. All right. So let's look to the architecture. So this particular architecture, the one which is there in front of you, is the one which helps you to understand the different subnets. So what you can see on a screen is basically subscriptions, the different networks, the different subnets, everything, isolation. So in terms of the connectivity, obviously, say for example, you can connect the Azure Virtual Desktop to the Azure AD as well also. And one more thing which would remind you that what we had discussed yesterday, the delegation, the logical architecture, subscription, resource groups, everything which comes in. With this, one more thing which comes up into the mind, which I like to really discuss about, is management, RBAC, administration. RBAC stands for role-based access control, delegation. So the identities which are assigning in your Azure Active Directory, they can be given different delegations as well. So as far as the authentication is being considered, as you can see that the Azure virtual desktop services are coming in between, whether it is related to the gateway, broker, and the session is being established. And these services are all being taken care of by the vendor. So if you see the significance of these components, the gateway checks the token, authentication happens. And then once the authentication and authorization happens, the second host is the one which creates a reverse connection to the client. So depending on from which particular client, the remote desktop clients you're establishing the connection, the request goes on all the way through the virtual desktop service to your directory. And after the validation of the successful credentials, so in between, there are some components which are coming in, likewise the gateway, as I mentioned, and the broker, the one which validates the database for the resources which have been given, the resources which have been assigned to the user. That one. So this way, this is going to be very helpful for you to have a relevance that how exactly it works on. So the idea is to understand that if in case you were having these services, this is how the a normal connection flow happens on a very high level discussion. If we talk about, so that is where how it is quite significant when it comes down to the connectivity, when it comes down to the reachability. So what is more important for us to make sure that the required components and the firewall ports have been configured in place. Further we go down, and if you see, obviously these services are connected over the network. In that case, what again comes up into the picture? The ports, the protocols. And moreover, if you see, whether you talk about Azure AD Connect, which establishes the hybrid connectivity, the virtual desktop, which connects to the session host, the session host connects to the broker service, the client gets connected. So in all these cases, If you talk about the elements, what is significant here itself is the ports and the protocols. That is more important and that is more relevant for us. And if you see from the client perspective, they have been using the different services like session connectivity, reverse connect transport. They're using session host communication channel. So in all these cases, every service has its own significance. Let's say, for example, if I talk about the session connectivity, right? What is that service? What is that relevant for? So the session connectivity basically is nothing but, or you can say the virtual desktop is using the RDP for what? To the end users, basically the remote display and the applications over the connections. Same way, you're using the reverse connect transport. That is one of the service which has been mentioned, which itself is using the TCP port 443. The signals are there in their own direction. So what is the purpose of the reverse connect transport? So this component, the reverse connect transport, which works on a protocol of TCP using the port of port 443, Azure Virtual Desktop is using this service for establishing the remote session, and it helps you for carrying the all entire RDP remote desktop traffic. And this again refreshes for the organization, for the customers who have been using the remote desktop services on the on-prem. So the reverse connect transport doesn't use as a TCP listener, rather it is using the incoming RDP connections. Instead, it is using outbound connectivity. Outbound connectivity to where itself? It is using the outbound connectivity to the Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure, and that too, it is using over a secured channel by using HTTPS. Same way, if you look up, there is one more service which is being referred as a session host communication channel. Why is that relevant? What is the significance of that service? So each and every service is responsible. Maybe let's say, for example, the Azure Virtual Desktop, the hosts are coming up. So there is an agent, the agent which is being referred as a remote desktop agent loader, which establishes the broker's communication channel, the persistent communication channel itself. And this communication channel is all working on a TLS or a service message exchange between what? Between the session host and the virtual desktop. So this service is being used in context when the session host wants to communicate with the virtual desktop service as a bus service in between. So overall, you can say that each and every client has its own specific connection sequence. So what are you using up? You're using the valid supported client of the Azure Virtual Desktop, the one which connects to the workspace. Workspace is again a platform, right? So once the user tries to connect, obviously in between the authentication comes up, whether you are being authenticated by the Azure AD, and based on that one, the Azure Virtual Desktop provides you a kind of a token, the one which validates. And after the successful itself, the client stores the configuration. So in all these process, the virtual desktop gateway also validates that where exactly the request is coming in, verifies and asks the broker to orchestrate the connection. And the virtual desktop identifies, based on to all of these validations, the appropriate session host. And with this, the remote desktop initiates a TLS connection. And once this has been done, obviously the gateway starts relaying the raw data between the both endpoints. And once this is all happened with the reverse connect transport, then you can say that the client starts the RTP connectivity, or you can say handshake kind of. So overall, this is this network connection is very helpful. Why? Because for us, maybe as an end user, for me itself, it might seem that we are connecting to the VDAs, we are connecting and launching the application, but behind the scene, what flow is happening, what process is being followed, that really matters for us. So this connection, these design, these structures, this flow, the communication and the connection, it is there. Now, as we have been talking about the network connections, the network connectivity, there is one more element which comes up into the picture, which is your security. Don't forget that. Why? Why? Because other than the connectivity itself, the firewall comes up, the ports are coming in. So the network security has to be managed. And as we are using the Azure services, the virtual network, the subnets. So what are the security elements in Azure in context with the VNet, in context with the subnets, in context to protect your workloads? What is there itself? So let's have a quick look about that as well, first of all. So one thing which comes up is one of the Azure services, and that service is being referred as Azure Firewall. Now, this particular firewall is also being configured in cloud. It's again a PaaS service, and it does require some dedicated subnet. And the good part is basically is the user configures the L3, L7 connectivity policies are there. It can be beneficial in terms of Microsoft threat intelligence. It can identify a known malicious IPs and FQDN filtering can be done. So you've got network rules, application rules, threat rules. And not only from that aspect, it also helps you to protect your connections, which are being established between the on-prem and to the cloud itself. So as I was talking about earlier, like the hub and spoke strategy, this is one of the key elements which plays a very key role. So this Azure firewall can also be considered as a virtual appliance. As we have been talking about the network connectivities, talking about hub and spoke topology, how does the connectivity can be protected or secured? So there is one concept which is called service chaining. So with the service chaining, you can go and achieve with a UDR. UDR stands for user defined route. So with the UDR, you can define the source, the destination, the next hop. So from the source through the next hop to the destination. So A, B, and C. Here A is relevant to the source. B is the next hop. And into the next hop, you have the network virtual appliance. And Azure Firewall can be also considered as one of the NVAs. And onto the destination can be one of your subnets. This concept of UDR, user defined route, UDR, user defined route. This is a concept which can be implemented within a VNet between the subnets. And it can also be configured between different VNets as well. So if you've got different workloads in different VNets, and if you're having the hub and spoke strategy and the connectivity or a topology, believe me, guys, this is going to be very helpful in terms of security implementation. Why? Why? Because everything goes with a centralized procedure, and you've got a visibility, and you've got a granular control as well. The idea is basically to protect your workloads. The idea behind to use this particular product would be to protect the connection, to secure the connection, to filter the secure traffic. So in all these cases, the Azure firewall can help you out to lock down the environment and filter your specific only allowed outbound traffic as well. So with this implementation, at least we can achieve this area. No doubt, each and every subnet, each and every subnet can be associated with a firewall, which is called NSG. NSG. NSG stands for Network Security Group. So each and every subnet can be configured with the NSG, and every NSG would be having the inbound and outbound rules. So having the inbound and outbound rules in place for the ID admins, for the network admins, it becomes very flexible that which ports, which protocols from the source to the destination can be configured and filtered if required or whenever required. So the implementation, although that NSG, the network security group, it helps you between the subnets. But what about across the subnets? What about the other routing traffic protocols, filtering? In that case, if you want to go and customize, if you want to have a tailored routes, route tables, nothing is better than the UDR, user defined route. And with that, at least you are achieving your service chaining concept. So no doubt, if you're planning to structure them up, don't forget to make them to be adopted and configured into your session. So as we are being deploying the workloads onto the cloud, as I mentioned earlier, that what are the procedures or what are the methodologies in which you can remotely connect if required for any kind of a remote administration. Let's say, for example, there are some virtual machines. I want to remotely connect them. So what are the services? What is the methodology? And in between, through which component it has to pass through, there is nothing but your firewall. Security again, a filter, a next hop. So moving ahead itself, this was a had talked about earlier itself, referring up to the virtual desktop session hosts by using Azure Bastion. So Azure Bastion is not only associated or related to the Azure Virtual Desktop. No. Yes, it is associated with a compute. It is associated with a virtual machine. Whether you talk about Windows, whether you talk about Linux, anything. Now, before I move down to the Bastion, Azure Bastion, what are the possibilities to connect remotely any of the Windows or the Linux? So you got approach of RDP, you got approach of SSH connections. What is the challenge? The challenge is basically opening those relevant ports. In many business cases, it might not be suggestible to open those ports for you. All right. So in that case, what is important? How can we achieve with any other alternate methods? So that is where the bastion comes up. Now with the RDP, obviously you need to have a RDP client. SSH connection has to be established. But if I say that, is there any mechanism in which we can connect these machines remotely over the browser by using HTTPS, TLS connection, by using port 443? The answer to that use case is nothing but which equals to Azure Bastion. So When you're configuring the Azure Virtual Desktop session host, the session host itself is a VM. So by any chance tomorrow, if in case for any given reason for the operations or for the administration, you might need to connect them privately, not publicly at least, why? Because from the security point of view, you're not going to expose anything with a public IP. These session hosts, usually they will be having some private IP. And for the connectivity itself, from the on-prem, you know that the connectivity methods which we talked about earlier, the point to site, your site to site, your express route, everything. So coming back to the Bastion basically it helps you to achieve with a remote connectivity by using HTTPS, TLS connection by using port 443. So you don't require any separate client for that one. So session host, yes, there is also a VM, a set of VMs basically. Each and every VM, which is basically a part of my host pool, is being referred as the session host. So this service is basically the one which helps you to understand, get the configuration, and Microsoft Bastion is the one which helps you to establish a secure connectivity, and it protects your virtual machines from being exposed, the RDP or SSH ports being exposed publicly to the outside world, and is still providing you a secure RDP and SSH connections over the browser. So, see, as we're talking about the networking components, one thing which again comes up, that what about the troubleshooting? What about the connection flow? What about filtering, identifying that whether the ports are allowed or not, whether the filtering is happening or not, why the connection is not allowed, or how is a network being designed, how many networks are there, how they're being connected, or which gateways you are having. So topology, I mean to say. So in that context, for any given network admin or the network team, it becomes key responsibility to have those features in place. So does Azure provides you any kind of a service? Yes. And that service is nothing but my Azure Network Watcher itself. See, this Azure Network Watcher is something, the one is the service which is inbuilt first of all. And this service can be enabled for multiple regions, all the regions, selective regions. And this network watcher is basically the one which gives you the flexibility to identify your network topology, your connection flow, your traffic flow, your troubleshooting in terms of ports allowed or not, identifying your next hop, and also having a visibility to the entire network topology as well. So from those aspects, this is going to be really very helpful for everyone itself, right? So network watcher is basically nothing but a tool, the one with the help of which you can monitor your diagnosis, your metrics, logging, everything which comes in, and you can have a connection monitor. So very reference, very helpful, and in troubleshooting itself also. So there is a monitor which is called connection monitor, which monitors entire communication at regular intervals. At least for the networking team, it will be easy for which you can be informed about the reachability, latency, topologies, changes, anything. And by any chance, if in case any of the endpoint goes down or unreachable, the connection troubleshoot informs you the reason, that what exactly was the reason is. And in context to this one, see, basically each and every element in terms of network we have been talking about, right? Whether it is in connectivity, whether it is in security, whether it is in firewall settings, whether it is in terms of monitoring, what about performance, what about consistency, what about latency, what about the communication priority, the traffic priority, So in that case, when we are talking about Azure Virtual Desktop, obviously, in that case, the latency does really matter. The traffic flow, it really does matter. The priority, it really does matter. So there is something which is being referred as a component in generic terms. Let's keep Azure by aside. In generic, when we talk about for any network components, we talk about a concept of QoS, quality of service. Now, what is exactly the quality of service is? Quality of service is basically something in which you can prioritize your sensitive or the critical traffic based on the communication flow. Now, these services are being recommendable to be adopted. So say, for example, if I'm working on a Teams and if I want to prioritize my video and audio channels traffics over a given network in compared to the other traffic itself, how can you achieve that? That is simply by doing by the help of implementation of the QoS, quality of service. No doubt, the setup, the configuration for the QoS is there. Group policies, network configuration, subnet configuration, client-side configuration. So why we are talking about here about the QoS? We're talking about the Azure Virtual Desktop. How QoS is related to this one? Why? Because at that particular point of time, when you're establishing the session to the session host from the client side, there are certain components which are coming in as a standard path. But if in case, if you want to bypass, channelize, and make them a direct connectivity and prioritize that traffic. So to achieve that one, we have a concept remote desktop protocol short path. Now, what is this short path? This short path is basically usually what happens after establishing the reverse connect transport. The client and the session host starts the RDP connection and negotiates the multi transport capabilities. The session host negotiates, sets up, configures. So in many cases, if the client has got a direct line of the site, the client establishes a secure connection with the session host as well. So the idea is basically that to make sure that the users have the flexibility in terms of the adoption. Now let me give you some insight about RDP short path. RDP short path is basically which is one of the really good feature of Azure Virtual Desktop first of all, that establishes a direct UDP based transport between what your RD clients, your remote desktop clients, and the the session hosts which are residing in your host pools. So RDP uses this transport to deliver, and the reason is basically for the reliability and the consistent latency. So overall, if you see that the key benefit is from the performance aspect, guys. When why? Because when we set up the connectivity, we don't want the end users to experience that, right? So RDP short paths is basically the one which helps you to bring the support for configuring the QoS. That is what I was talking about the QoS, that how come the QoS is related. So RDP short path is something the one with the help of which you are configuring the QoS to prioritize for your RDP connections as well, right? That is how it's being relevant. So as you can see that the session host sends the connection, you have got a client start connectivity, initial connection starts with the reverse connect transports. And if by any chance, if the client is having a direct line, they can establish a secure connection. So what are you going to adapt? What are you going to use? is nothing but the short path configuration. And when it comes down to the configuration itself, obviously, yes, there are certain settings within a group policies where exactly you can go and enable. So there is one small configuration, and that can be done very easily over the policies. And to do so, let's say, for example, if I'm sitting on a client machine, I can install the administrative templates, and from there itself, you can enable the RDP short path listener for your given managed networks as well. So there is a procedure. Uh, yes, so there has to be a section. So within your group policy, there is a administrative template for the Azure Virtual Desktop, and that particular template is being referred as AVD GPD template dot cap files. These template files are the cap files, basically administrative templates, I mean to say. So if you've got that administrative template configured in your group policy, from there itself, you can simply configure and enable the RDP short path for the managed networks as well. So this is one setting, and obviously when you're just it's not about enabling the RDP short path, is basically also configuring your firewall settings as well. So if you see that it is using the ports which have to be allowed, in which you want to allow the inbound traffic for the RDP short path, in your Defender firewall itself, you can open and you can define the protocol. And yeah, you can see that, okay, this is simply going to use the protocol type UDP and the port, which is your 3390, right? So the firewall should allow the particular port. It's not only about enabling the RDP, it's basically also allowing the port as well also. And by any chance, if in case if you're using any of those particular firewalls, this port has to be allowed as well. And this was the one context which I wanted to explain it to you with the quality of service. And why? Because whenever you work with the workloads, whenever you connect them remotely itself, there are so many challenges. You experience jitter, you experience packet loss, there is some sort of a delayed round trip times, isn't it? So from that aspect, the implementation, the RDP short path for the managed networks, it helps you to enable the configuration of the QS policies in the RDP itself. So this is the QS, which is the implementation, which allows the real-time RDP traffic that is very, very sensitive to the network delays. It can cut in line. So the configuration is to be enabled from the policies, the GPO, and the firewall port has to be allowed. So guys, with this section, we come towards the end of the networking component. All right. And now we are actually moving down to the another key element, which is also one of the key factors which you should be taking care of. And that section is basically nothing but your storage. All right. Now, as we have been talking about storage itself, guys, we are going to consume the Azure storage, and into the Azure storage itself, there are different types of storage types. You've got a storage general purpose one, version 2, depending on the type of the storage, whether you want to go with the managed, whether you want to go with the unmanaged, anything it can be, right? So in most of the cases, if I talk about what is going to be there in the storage, oh, you can keep your data, backups, content, profiles, the user data, everything. So what I'm going to look into, if I'm setting such kind of a storage for the profiles, for the user data, for the content, for the customer itself, it becomes a key responsibility to set up each and every element. As we have been talking about the Azure Virtual Desktop itself, the storage plays a very key role. And Azure Virtual Desktop service is basically is what Microsoft recommends is there is one of the service which is called FS Logics. which is mainly being helpful in terms of setting up the profile containers, especially in context of Azure Virtual Desktop. So if I talk about the best and the recommended solution in terms of the profile containers, FS Logics is one of the profile solutions itself also, right? Although there have been some other tools which was being used, which was being referred as a UPD. UPD stands for User Profile Disk, which is almost going to be deprecated in future versions of your virtual desktop. So this discussion is all going to happen for the FS Logics itself, right? So FS Logic itself, see, when we talk about configuring the storage for the FS Logics, it's we set up the file share, we set up a VM, we set up a virtual machine, right? And then we set up a file share onto that virtual machine, file share itself, I mean to say. And that particular file share is going to be used for the user profiles. So that particular file server itself is also residing somewhere in your Azure. Ah, when it comes down to the virtual machine, again, a planning, availability, backup, disaster recovery, everything comes up, guys. So I'm not going to repeat them once again. So yeah, a virtual machine has to be set it up with the specific file share for what particular reason? For the user profiles. So in that context, this is a service which is being recommended. So when it comes down to the configuring, when it comes down to the connectivity, the user, the one which is the remote desktop user itself, is the one with the help of which you can they can get connected up. They log into the client, and as soon as they establish the connection to the session host which resides in one of your pools, the key part is basically for the user to get up the profile. And in that case, they get up the profile from one of the file shares. It can be an Azure file share, it can be a file server itself also. So these file shares are basically being provided up as soon as the user gets connected and establishes a session. And user gets all of these, and the product and the component which you are using up is nothing but the FS logics as well, right? So FS logics is something which is being quite designed specifically for your roaming profile in remote computing environments. And the good example is your Azure Virtual Desktop. So the entire, or you can say the complete user profile in the single container is being stored. So during the sign-in, this container is being dynamically. Now, what is the process? The process says that probably this is being configured so that it can be dynamically being attached. So here it happens. So you have profile containers designing for the roaming profiles, connects with the complete user profile itself. It gets connected during the signing in, and it gets attached as a VHD or a VHDX. So these are the disks which are having the user profiles, and they're all stored to a specific location and attached to the users the next time they sign in. So what exactly the user profile is, what exactly the user profile contains. We have been talking about user profile containers, but think about a situation that, okay, what exactly the user profile contains. A user profile is nothing but which actually contains the data elements, including your desktop settings, your network connections, your application settings, and Windows creates a local profile that is tightly integrated with the operating system. So for the end user, the remote user profile provides a partition. It allows the operating system be replaced. So this is going to be very, very helpful. And when it comes down to the management of the storage, yes, you have to set up the storage accounts. Now here itself, if we talk about the storage accounts onto the cloud, we are referring up to the Azure storage. And just to remind you guys, once we finish with this discussion, at the end, there is obviously, as I mentioned at the initial stage, at the very beginning of this session, that I will be showing you a small demo in which at least you can have some understanding what type of storage is available, which service am I talking about, and what are the key elements which you are supposed to take care of. So when it comes down to the storage, we are referring up to the Azure storage, all right? And Azure storage itself, it comes up in different types, right? So Azure provides you the general purpose version one, you've got a file storage, you've got a file share storage, everything it can be. So these configurations would be done and these configurations would be required. So which different types of storage which I'm talking about, that is all in front of you now. All right. So general purpose version 2, which is called GP version 2. So this is very helpful in which you can easily go and deploy your file shares, standard hard disks, SDDs, right? So here itself we are talking about the unmanaged. Remember, when you are creating up the storage, when you are creating up the storage account, it all falls under the unmanaged. That means the customer is responsible to take care of that one. All right. And similarly, you still have one more option, which is called the file storage account. The file storage account is specifically being used in which you can go and deploy Azure file shares. Why? Why? Because I'm looking for a premium solid state disks, SSD disk or a premium disk. In that case, the recommendation from Microsoft is that you should be using the file shared storage, right? And the file storage accounts can only be used to store your Azure file shares. No other storage resources. Like as I mentioned earlier, that you've got a page blob, you've got a block blob, you've got a tables, you've got a queues. So those services cannot be stored into the Azure file share. Only the Azure file shares are being stored in your file storage. On the other side, if I do require to store the page blobs, now you must be thinking, what exactly the page blob is. Page blobs are basically those blobs which are quite extensive in read and write. So what is a good example? The virtual hard disk, the VHD file. The virtual hard disk file itself is a good example of a page file. What about the block blob? Block blobs are those blobs which are not extensive in read and write. So you can have documents, videos, MP3 files, MPEG files, PowerPoint, Excel sheets, anything it can be. So those kind of a contents, they fall under the category of block blobs. So page blobs are there, block blobs are there, containers are there, queues are there, tables are there. Developers, they use queues and the tables extensively. So if you want to store them for that one itself, obviously you have to go with the general purpose version. Storage account services. All right. That is how it works up. So when it comes down to the creation of the file shares, which you're going to use for the user profiles, it's very, very simple that you can go and create up a storage account. And one more thing which you can see over your screen is that when you go and set up the storage accounts, you can set up the different tiers. Tiers is basically you've got a hot tier, you've got a cool tier, or you've got a archive tier as well also, right? Cool or hot. Hot means why you're going to set up that tier. The content which you're going to store into the storage, that is going to be the frequently accessed, that falls under the hot tier. Cool, infrequent data access. Archive, for a long period of access, which you want to preserve for a long period of time. Maybe let's say think it from the governance, compliance, from that aspect, which you want to keep it for a longer period of time. So that archive tier is also there, one of the cases. So you've got multiple tiers: hot, cool, and tier. Hot, cool, and archive. All right. So In that context, these tiers have to be very carefully picked up depending on the type of the content which you are going to store, the type of the contents which you are going to configure it. All right, here. And with this one itself, let's say, for example, if I'm setting up the storage, obviously the disks can be configured, the disks can be structured, the disks can be stored. So creating the disk is not a big deal. So the service which you're creating up, you can add the disks at any given point of time, and you can set them up itself also, right? So guys, with this particular section itself, we have almost reached towards the end of the second lesson of the module of today itself. And yes, as I had mentioned at the very beginning of the session, that towards the end, I will be showing you a small demo for this one here. All right. So to do that, basically here it comes up. So I would be starting the demo very soon itself. Maybe here itself, for a few seconds, the session would be stuff for the presenting. I need to switch back to my own portal interface. So for a few seconds, it's going to be a bit of impact. So I'm just bringing up my browser and setting that up itself also. All right, so I'm about to come up. Here it comes. So as you can see on my interface itself, I've been connected to one of my Azure subscriptions. This is one of my active subscription here itself. All right. So you can use that as well also. And you've got a service and Azure Virtual Desktop Service. You have you have the resources. You can see that the service which is there with the virtual desktop. All right. And you've got a host pools. All right. Yeah. There you go. So you got a workspaces, you got a host pools. So here, one host pool, and this host pool is going to have your session host. See, as I told you, this session host is nothing but a collection of, it's a VM itself, which is this one. And if I click onto that, you can manage that VM itself also. You can see the status. And if I go down to the virtual machine, you will notice a virtual machine there itself running up. So it's a VM. It's a full-fledged infrastructure as a service. And by any chance, if in case if I want to connect, you can use the Bastion, which I was referring earlier. See, this one. So you can easily set up the Bastion with the help of which you can connect any of the virtual machines over the browser by using HTTPS. All right. And it becomes easy in terms of management. As far as the disks are being considered, I was talking about at any moment of time, you can add multiple disks, additions of the disks. So yeah. So you've got a choice, create and attach. So where are these disks coming up? So let me take you to the storage section here. Storage, storage account. This was a section which we were talking about earlier. So this, while I'm creating up a storage itself, this falls under the unmanaged, and you can create a storage, provide a storage account name. And here itself, I was talking about the general purpose version 2. Yeah, say if in case if you want to use all of your different services like blobs, tables, page queues, page blobs, your file shares, prefer to go with the version 2 itself. Or else, in many cases, if I'm looking for the file shares specifically, I can go with that as so premium account. And yeah, with this one itself, when you're setting up the storage accounts, there is something which is called redundancy. So if you look up, you have got multiple choices of redundancy that ensures the replication of the contents, availability of the contents, depending on whether they are being replicated within the data center, across the data centers, across the regions, across the zones. So availability of the content, redundancy of the infrastructure itself. So that is something which is quite helpful, which is again to be taken care of by the customer. And obviously, yes, when it comes down to the networking, you can restrict. So this was a section which I was talking about earlier, that how it is significant and how it is relevant for us. Why? Because I don't want to allow any kind of a traffic, all the traffic from the public. So probably you can think about of setting up the service endpoints, private connectivity, rather than allowing everything from the public access. That is also one of the key concern, right? And you can set that up as well. And from the data protection, you can have some recoveries, soft recovery, soft deletes, recovery, kind of a recycle bin settings in which you can delete and you can restore them days to retain the deleted items, whether it is for your blobs, whether it is your containers, whether it is your file shares, and also from the encryption perspective, you can encrypt by using the encryption keys. So all these things, the elements which have to be taken care of by the customer, and they are going to be responsible for that itself. All right. So now let's go back in to the slides itself here. So here itself, see, basically there was a small quick demo which we wanted to see and set them up itself also, right? So with this, we are almost coming towards the end of the session itself. So before we move down and end of the session itself, let me just quickly give you a very quick recap what we talked about today. We talked about the networks, the network connectivity methods. We talked about the services, all right. And we also talked about the different security measures, the one which you can consider, and also from the storage perspective. So guys, with this uh, session itself, once we finish up, there are a few labs which are supposed to be done by you, which are basically been coming up as the homework labs, in which you're going to set up the host pools. You're going to set up the session host images. All right. So this brings up with the section up. There are certain areas and there is some certain amount of a practice. Obviously, after the session, it is going to help you out to understand more better. And practically, at least you'll be getting some hands-on to set up these host pools, PowerShell, graphical interprets, everything. All right. So this is it. So with this one itself, we have reached towards the end of the session for today. And being the day to itself, we are coming towards the end. Thank you so much for everyone for being there itself in this session, especially you took out some time. And I do really appreciate your presence, your availability. And yeah, that's it. So have a nice evening. Take care of yourself. Goodbye. And see you guys tomorrow once again with the day 3 contents. Thank you so much, all of you. Goodbye. Thank you. So take care of yourself and see you guys tomorrow once again with the day 3 session. Thank you once again to all of you.